Thank you for the invitation, and we are really happy to be here. So the case we are presenting is the residential micro-district number 1 in Ulaanbaatar, and we divided the presentation into 4 main parts, so I will give some brief introduction parts. So the Mongolia is in Central Asia. We are a landlocked country neighboring with just 2 countries, neighbors, Russia and China. And we are a post-socialist country, and it's a relatively small population, around 3 million, just 3 million population, but relatively big land. And traditionally, historically we are nomadic people, so the city or the settlement is kind of relatively different, and the Ulaanbaatar is the capital, which is located on the historical route between this eastern settlements, eastern part of Russia and northeastern part of China, and the root origin of this Ulaanbaatar was the nomadic city, which were moved 29 times before this, before settling this current location in 1778. And we had 2 main some kind of revolution, the transition. After this this communist revolution in 1921, this capital, this Ulaanbaatar city was named as a capital city, and the population reached 1 million just in the 2007, very recently. And these are the original maps during this 20th century, and the first 2 are showing the kind of urbanization process and urban expansion till the mid-20th century, and the expansion was quite an organic way, but since 1950s, the city became more kind of modernized and grew in a planned way. In terms of architecture or this built-up structures, the original urban fabric was more consists from more traditional dwellings, like we called ger, and there were historically very few number of religious temples related buildings. And since 1940s or 30s, the number of housing projects were implemented, and these late stories were really related with this Soviet Union, Russian Soviet Union policies. And in around after the World War, in Russia there were some urgent needs to provide the housing in a mass scale, and they introduced this prefabricated panel building system, and which lately named as that Khrushchevka. And these type of structures were also get introduced in Ulaanbaatar. Then on the last photo, we call it the 2nd generation of the prefabricated panel buildings, which started from 70s. And during this second half of 20th century, the Ulaanbaatar city has got introduced this 4 urban master plans, and according to these 4 master plans, there were 22 residential residential districts were designated, but nine of them were constructed partly, and on this map shows the black dots are the built, constructed micro districts, and which is the one on the left. This is the micro district number 1, which is our case area, and as for this micro district project, it is really related the development of construction sector and urbanization in Mongolia. So in 1962, Mongolia became the member of this Soviet economic assistance kind of alliances, and by being the member of this organization, we got a lot of economic assistance, particularly for this industrialization and also this urbanization process. And according this type of assistance program, 3 main construction factories were built during this time, 60s, and these are the main. This was the main organizations for built this mass residential neighborhoods. And this is the original master plan. We call it sub-master plan of the micro district number 1, and this is the neighborhood consists from 6 neighborhood units, and before this plan introduced, the land was just free, the open land in the steppe land in the south and little hilly land in the north part, and this master plan was produced by the Russian Urban Planning Institute, called it Kiprogor, and also the local professionalists.
Sur cette photo satellite, vous pouvez voir l'état du micro-district.
On this satellite photo, you can see an aerial view of the district. The size and scale of these buildings gives a fairly clear reading of its structure. With time, its surroundings have become considerably denser. So for the south, you can see the big avenue, which is called Bis Avenue, which is the backbone of the city of Ulan Bator. There's a freight station, a big materials market, which is called the Black Market, and a market which is a food market. To the west, there are recent residential districts which were built at the beginning of the 2000s. In the north, you can see these rather special-looking, odd-looking districts, which are the districts which began to emerge in the 1980s, though they existed elsewhere in Ulan Bator. And in the east is the big hospital, the Ulan Bator Hospital, and another micro-district. This picture gives you an idea of the broad morphology of the fabric of Ulan Bator. And on this plan, this drawing, you can see the fabric was not constructed in one go, but it evolved greatly over time, and quite quickly in the space of 30 years. So the micro-district was built between 85 and 86 in just 3 years, except for the final tower blocks, which were built in the 1990s. Then came the markets and the development of a connected architecture, in particular a so-called informal district sector, which arose after the collapse of the political regime. From 95 until the beginning of this century, the quartier de guerre, which I think means war districts, with a type of architecture linked with that form of economy, but on a fairly small scale. Then from the 2000s until about 2015, densification increased and the scale of construction became more extreme. So, to present the district, we developed two kinds of studies which relate a bit to the typology that we observed, which differ from each other in terms of scale and the planning process and construction process, and in the society model that they embody. But it needs to be understood that in the case of number one micro-district, these two systems are connected and make some of the specificity of the district. So what we have called the hard system at the top left, which refers to some extremely normative and quantitative forms of socialist planning, which embody the idea of a collectivist society. So this principle is developed according to the principle of elementary units that we were talking about in the case of Tashkent. What we see here is three subsets, three residential units, which together then form the micro-district, the entity, micro-district entity. They're all designed according to the same scheme. In other words, residential blocks constitute a sort of envelope around an interior space which is entirely pedestrianized, which includes schools, crèche, clinics, everything needed for day-to-day life in the micro-district. And what needs to be understood, very importantly, is that each subunit is designed as an autonomous element, which will then cluster together in order to form the socialist city. To give a simple term to this system, it behaves a bit like a skeleton, the skeleton of the micro-district. The second category is what we call the soft system. The first was hard, this is soft. And these are spatial and architectural systems that arise from the needs and adaptation of a population and the need to adapt the architecture to lifestyles, to a lifestyle which is based on the family and individual and collective scale. And this takes multiple forms, multiple varieties, and also operates on different scales. But what it in fact does is to reshape the planned space of the micro-district to adapt it to the new uses that have come with the change in economic system and social system. So with the collapse of state systems, distribution of goods, and the economy, people were facing a rural exodus and a rise in unemployment. And the whole economic system is held together by private entrepreneurship, which in the 1990s was called the informal economic sector, and which ended up by producing this architecture, which adapted the structures of the micro-districts to this new way of living in the city. So first, these new activities were introduced primarily on the edges of the micro-districts, and thereby produced a milieu that was propitious, that was conducive to a certain form of social life. And the architecture takes a variety of forms and different scales, from changes to the ground floor, right through to additions up to 10 meters, which provided space for a whole set of activities nearby, which were came in as a substitute for the big state services previously provided. But we can also see here the alignment in the pedestrian spaces. We find a lot of small commerces, building shops opening up in public space. But this is a system that doesn't only affect the built forms, the architecture, but there's a more fragile, more temporary use of these spaces by street sellers, and the use of all kinds of urban street furniture to install very temporary businesses that might be present for just a day, but in a sense are also permanent. So these spaces, which are very, very lively, but they're also limited on the outside of the micro-district, where the micro-district is in contact with the street space, which has shifted from its original very functional role to a sort of landscape, which has been brought about by the building of these extensions. You see it happening a little bit within the micro-district, but the building arrangement has maintained the interior of the district in its very residential form from its origin. That means pedestrian spaces designed purely for the population, the residential population, and then these huge courtyards with playgrounds for children, sports grounds for adults, and then courtyards where people can assemble. And there are also places where plantings grow, and which are managed both publicly and privately by two organizations, which is called the SOR, which is the equivalent of our condominium committee, and then the district committee, which in particular have organized what you might call somewhat unmanaged appropriation of these spaces by the residents. In particular, it's the arrival of private ownership and private cars have generated this architecture, which is a sort of container architecture, which has spread within the micro-district and has actually been managed by the administration in order to keep some control. These containers are a sort of supplement to the apartments and the standardized residential areas.
que comme on a pu le dire précédemment, cette architecture est le
So,
résultat d'un procédé
as we said
industriel.
before, this architecture is the outcome of an industrial process using prefabricated panels.
Ce procédé de construction est
And
vraiment
this construction process is a kind of a mix of industry and construction site, which is only economic
sur un quartier de 80 hectares
after 10,000, when there are 10,000
et
dwellings.
donc on est bien en présence de cette architecture générique.
So what we see here is the
à l'exception
generic architecture you find on the whole Euro-Asian continent, except that this architecture is somewhat adjusted for Mongolian conditions, notably earthquakes and the wind. The buildings form a kind of envelope around the residential buildings, with a sort of envelope to the south, which contains loggia and an internal face, internal side, which protects the apartments from the cold winds from the steps. It's on these buildings that, in the final example of what we call the soft system, you can see the designs of this standardized architecture, which is then extensively transformed or converted by its inhabitants in their own individual ways, using materials that are not necessarily of good quality, but are very diverse, and which tend to produce the differentiation of habitat needed that Ivan Illich himself spoke about, as mentioned by our keynote speaker.
As for the heart system, there were also a number of transformation situations happened, and the main part is the new parasites or the new constructions constructed around this neighborhood, because mainly from the engineering infrastructure availability and also this space availability, and also that land acquisition or land ownership related issues. There were a number of new constructions were constructed, and you can see from this map the color figure shows this newly built. Some are residential and some are multifunctional buildings, and this red constructions are mostly the commercial and also some residential functions because of this main road. And this is the image of the original built-up area and the newly emerging constructions. And even this one case is stopped. This construction site work is stopped because of this residents' protest against this kind of new constructions, because mainly the residents are kind of against because of the more traffic and also more this movements and also this space sharing. So there are a number of cases of the residents protests. And yeah, this on the first photograph, we can see this construction site, this land prepared for this new construction, but after this residents protests, they stopped. And this is the more recent trend, like on the south of this case area, there are also new residential developments were constructed, and these are built by just individual investors, and it is planned in this type of residential environment. There is not so much general system. It's just constructed and developed by individually and sell mostly this free market supply and demand system.
En conclusion, j'aimerais revenir sur
to conclude, I'd like to go back to the exercise
d'étudier ce quartier
that allowed me to study this district.
C'est-à-dire que cette étude s'est faite à travers
in fact, the
une
study
démarche de projet
was done
avec
through
mon binôme
a
Nicole Desbarres.
project approach
Et,
with my partner Nicole
partant de
Desbarres.
ces observations de terrain et de
And
ces
on the
catégories
basis of
de
these
soft
field
et de
observations and these categories of soft and
avec
hard,
la richesse
and the
d'usage
close
et
connection
d'espace à l'intérieur du
that
micro-
develops
premier
the
Et
network of
considérant,
uses and practices within the micro-district.
l'évolution à venir du quartier, par exemple.
We thought about the future evolution of the district. For example, these big blocks which make the micro-district look a bit ridiculous
On a décidé
next to
de
them.
se positionner non pas
We decided to
à
take up a
l'intérieur du
position
quartier,
not
mais plutôt sur ces
within
limites
the
qui
district,
semblaient
but
être
rather on its
les-
boundaries,
les lieux
which seem to be the
plus,
places the most,
comment dire, les plus à même d'être rapidement transformés.
the places that seem
Et,
most
ici,
ready
vous
to be
pouvez voir
transformed.
une des limites sud,
And this is here one of the southern boundaries of the
qui est,
district.
donc ce territoire composite
So it's a
entre,
composite territory
entre les deux
made up
les deux unités
between
d'habitation, le centre
between
de
the
service,
residential
au sud,
units,
le
the
marché,
service centres to the south,
et
the market to the south, sorry.
la projection d'un futur métro.
And so there's the plan for a future subway.
Et donc pour nous,
So
fort de toutes ces
for us,
observations,
with all these
le,
observations,
le moyen était d'articuler en fait l'existant avec le futur et de
the
faire
approach was to
temporalité
link
et de
the
protéger,
present with the
le
future,
fragile écosystème
and to try and think about
que
protecting a
représentent, en
rather
fait, ces pratiques
fragile
habitantes,
ecosystem,
l'usage de
the ecosystem that we
l'espace,
find in these uses of
commun.
space and
pour ce faire, en fait,
resident
on est
practices.
passé par
And to
la
do this, what we
création
did,
d'un principe
we
constructif
created
modulaire, c'est un
a
assemblage
building
de charpentes
principle,
capable de se développer en 3 dimensions,
which is
dans l'idée de créer des liens,
a kind of
des surfaces
prefabricated
disponibles.
framework
Et,
which can develop in all in 3
par ces
dimensions,
variations d'écartement, de pouvoir,
and by the different
autoriser
gaps
ou non,
between
certains
structures,
usages.
we could make certain practices and
donc ce
uses of the
projet,
structure
en tout cas
possible
sur,
or prevent them.
Sur la partie sud, visait à
And this
articuler le
project
marché avec
on
le
the
futur
southern
métro,
part, the aim of
le
it
port
was to
commerçant et
connect
les
the
immeubles
market with the
via le
future
commun
subway,
supermarché, tout en,
maybe with a supermarket,
tout en prodiguant donc ces espaces de disponibilité nécessaires à l'établissement de certaines
while
pratiques
providing
d'intimité
spaces
collective, autorisant la création
conducive
d'extensions
to the
et
development
donc
of
continuer de
resident
permettre à ce
practices
système d'exister
so that the subsystem can sort of exist within the transformation of the city.
Et surtout de fabriquer.
And above all, the aim, the idea, the main idea
de cette espèce d'hybride entre
was to
architecture et
create
infrastructure.
this sort of
créer un
hybrid
milieu
between
propice.
infrastructure and structure.
Nous sommes intéressés à
And
la
then
limite nord,
we looked
qui
at
est
the
justement
northern
cette zone de
boundary,
contact du micro
which is the
avec
contact
le
point
quartier
between
Gare à
the
travers, justement, une région
micro-district and
naturelle assez-
the
pas
Gare
naturelle,
district,
mais une barrière physique qui est un grand
in the
canal
form
collecteur d'eau pluviale
of a
qui
barrier,
sépare ces
which
deux
is a
quartiers.
big canal for collecting
Et,
rainwater, which
là,
passes
encore
through
une
the
fois,
district.
un peu d'une façon
And
différente,
here again,
l'idée
but in
était
a different way, the
d'accompagner,
idea was to support
les transformations futures
future
et la
transformations
vitalité d'un quartier
and the
libre avec,
vitality of
le micro-district et de
of
prodiguer
district and with the
aux uns comme aux
micro-district,
autres les qualités des uns et des autres
and to
sans,
develop the qualities of
altérer
both of them
forcément,
without necessarily
les
undermining
écosystèmes
them,
habitants de
without
ces-
damaging
de
the
ces
existing
de ces
ecosystem of residential practices and lifestyles.
Voilà.
Okay.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous.
Hello, all of
Et à
you.
chacun en particulier. Merci aussi à Olivier et à
Thank you, Olivier and Marianita, for the invitation. I'm going to go quickly today because I've only got 30 minutes. I'm going to talk about these districts, which we can see on the screen there. It's called the ZEN. It's not about repairing motorcycles, but an acronym for Zone of Expansion, a Northern Expansion Zone, because it's in the north of the city. So for the first part, I will follow the technical form that they asked us to prepare. That's what I'll talk about. So I won't talk quite in the same way as my predecessors, because they're architects. This is going to be much more DIY. But what interests me is the question of buildings and the destiny of buildings. And the second part, there will be a sort of a broken beam, as it were.
Quelle est la transformation de laquelle on peut penser dans la ZEN? À quelle échelle?
What scale should we think about this zone? What is the scale of this area?
C'est-à-dire apprendre les rapports à l'espace sans le réduire à l'usage,
to take the relation to space without reducing it to use, and how can we project that into a pre-existing order? That's the question I asked myself. So when I lived, that's something I noticed when I lived in this district. And the possible interpretations in these cases help us to think about is that the in-between spaces in Palermo, in ZEN, is both, and depending on your point of view, is either a way of stigmatizing the people who live there, but it's also a way of encouraging personal creativity. So let's go. The district is the north of the city. That's its location. That's a bird's eye view, an aerial view. That I took in 2007.
C'est ici le quartier. Non, on ne voit pas. Non, il disait d'utiliser Stéphane, mais n'image pas. Donc, vous voyez,
as you can see, that platform is the district. That's taken recently, as you can see here again. It's in the north. There are three areas which I'll distinguish in terms of typology. So, very different times of construction under three different regulatory systems, legal systems. And these are the famous blocks. So this is a new thing that was built in 2010. It began to, it's a big Auchan shopping center.
So
the residential complex was built in three waves, which corresponds to three typologies. So there was farming land. That's where they were built at that time. There was space. Because it's thought that in the north of Palermo, in the master plan, that there would be a great deal of industrial development. So the city master plan, which was completed in 1962, identified this land based on expected location of industrial development which was supposed to happen around the same area. What's interesting is there's no industry. So over time, it was a sort of adoption of land without industrialization. As you can see on this photo, it's quite remarkable. I'll stand up. You can see the first. You can see the first wave of construction, and then the second, and then you see these 10 floor blocks, and then the great blocks of Gregotti, which began in 1985 up to 2000. And it's that part that's become the metonymy, the metaphor for the whole district.
En réalité, on a trois projets différents. Donc, le premier, comme je vous disais,
The first, as I said,
une chose que j'ai découvert, c'était les
one thing I discovered
316 logements qui
was
étaient
the 3016 dwellings
restés vides jusqu'au 1968. Terminés,
which remained
ils sont restés
empty
vides
until
10 ans,
1968
mais
for 10
une
years.
nuit, 300 personnes les ont occupés illégalement.
But they had 300 squatters living on them.
La question de la modernité à Palermo.
And that was a story that affected the concept of modernity in Palermo. So it's this part of the district, they're very low rise,
Google View.
and that's Google View.
Vous voyez, c'est une typologie
That's a street view. The typology is fairly visible. The second wave was ZEN L,
c'est la figure de l'expansion nord
which was the
la ville à Rome. C'était des bâtiments à 10 étages.
10-story buildings.
Photo aussi remarquable parce qu'il y a
That's a fairly remarkable photo because ZEN 2 wasn't yet built.
de se bâtir.
And it's ZEN 2, ZEN 1 that's being built.
Les grands projets de Gregor.
And finally, it's Gregorti's great project with the blocks, with the insular island typology, which fundamentally constituted, here are the plans, the models. You can also download them from the internet. So it's become a very common image in Italy. You see it everywhere. Nothing special what you see here. And it's the three threads of blocks with services where the amenities were next door. Here there were the schools, sports facilities, and here you have schools and industrial activity. Inside you also have the small shops. You can see the link between Z1 and Z2, and inside these blocks, in these parallelipeds, you have things like nurseries, creche, what they call local services. So here are the prospectus in relation to this nearby hills. And what is this? This is the model of the ZEN that was presented at the Guggenheim. This was expressed, shown as an expression of Italian design, the famous exhibition Italian Metamorphosis. Though in fact at that time it was already an example of the downgraded periphery of Italy, of Italian cities. So here you have the prospectus. Inside there are courtyards. There's an elevated sides which have to be they're sort of internal courtyards. Big problem. As you know, when you're building projects, there are a lot of changes, and this was changed twice to correspond to the anti-earthquake laws of 75. And then it was remodeled for, as a result of the change in the heritage status of two protected structures, the Villa Mercadone. And so as you can see, of the three threads, there are now, original three threads, and there are now four threads. And these are protected areas, and this was industrial development. And here, Fondo Trapani. So they redesigned the original project. Very briefly, the project is a compact city which dialogues with the surrounding fabric. In 75, Prima Romoso and Gorgotti presented the model of this project, and the aim was that it should dialogue with nature, but not nature inside, nature outside. So what he wanted to do as well, he wanted to recreate the concept of the historic city centre, a place of face-to-face meetings in the courtyard. So very nearby pedestrian streets. So here's an internal construction. As you can see, here you have washing hanging out, but we don't call that appropriation, it's normal in Italy. Impossible in France to hang out your washing like this, but here in Italy, this is what we would call personalization, customization. So we're going to see what the inhabitants do here. As you can see here again, you can see the head of the insula of the islands. It's a very beautiful place in itself. Here is a photograph taken at the time of construction. Here it's complete. And here we're inside the insula, the islands, where cars can go through. And here we have a roof view on the ZEN 2, so we've closed loggia. I also asked my architect friends. Nobody has done a survey of all the changes that residents have made to these places. It could be a very interesting thing to do, because perhaps you would discover the essence without actually having to identify each one. And here again, so that's ZEN. We'll go quickly. Why am I showing you this? Because there's something here that is disruptive. The photos don't tell you anything about the social relations which the residents have between each other and with the city. Because the idea, the settlement was chosen for the lower middle class, urban lower middle class, not for workers. Gregotti wanted to address this kind of construction for the petite bourgeoisie in Palermo. And I can tell you it never happened in Palermo. And what's characteristic of the relation with the space is that most of the people began by occupying all these buildings illegally. They were squatters. In other words, you can go in by breaking the doors, but before the construction is completed. As you can see that over the years, the region has had to regularize the residential situation of the people living there. So until 2000-2010, ZEN was Islam, so it's an interesting question. So there were a lot of projects for operations on ZEN, for transformation. So all these operations had quite some positive effects. But in 2010, work began to refurbish the whole district, because people said that the blocks were damaged and needed refurbishing. So people began to occupy them illegally. People would move into the unfinished apartments, and of course it was squatting. Of course they were connected, they had their computers and USB dongles, so that's how people began. So people create an informal market on the doors, there were the family names, because the post was delivered to these illegal residents. People were getting their letters. So here you've got the police coming to evict them. In Palermo, every year, squatting is a common thing. So, what we have different regimes of representation for this space. We're talking about the design space, which expresses rationality with its criteria. Then you have the construction stage, which is the representation of either residents or social workers, teachers, journalists, art directors. I have to think about the word representative in this. And then we have the people who do the master plan for the city, people who say that ZEN is a non-city. Nobody lives in ZEN. This is the kind of erudite or outside view of people looking at the space. So, as I was saying to you, when I was showing the model, and the same month, that was the same month as the model was presented at the Guggenheim, there was an article about the abandonment of the district. Because in ZEN it's not only cement, it's not just cement. What are the materials with which you build a district? It's words and images. You can talk as much as you want about cities today, but you've got to think about the imaginary and the visual factors. And perhaps I'll tell you a story that might make you laugh. It's quite sad. There was a film director who worked in ZEN, who dismantled a garbage skip and distributed used syringes around in order to demonstrate the deterioration of the district. So one of the things that I want to show you, I'm going quickly, you never see the internal life of people. All you see is garbage, old cars, great piles of garbage. Are these people savages? No, the problem is that people don't come into these poor districts in order to pick up the garbage. Their services are lacking. So it's interesting to look at the city not from a perspective of waste management, but to think about the meaning of garbage and think about spatial justice. Palermo is a very dirty city. A lot of cities in Italy are dirty. So what we have this is not ZEN, this is a rich district of the city. So this is Mondello luxury real estate. So there's always old mattresses in the street. So this is what we mean about urban garbage. So the media representation produces a separation between the normal city and the abnormal city. There's a kind of boundary. And people even talk about frontier people. So on one side there are the residents who have no voice but are over exposed in the media. And then you have a list of the social pathologies, unemployment, sexuality, violence, promiscuity, incapacity to delay gratification, etc. And then below you have so we're not talking about stereotypes and stigma. And stigma is a way of refusing people their humanity. So what we have here is the built space, the distance from the periphery. So you can see what you have here is a difference in social universes. There's a different social universe because it's perverse. The relation to built space is traditionally understood on the basis of this opposition, this difference. And all the discussions have mostly been about the quality of the construction and have forgotten that people were already living there and changing them. So we say that every city has its own ZEN, its damaged areas, if you like. The question is that the stigmatization is not just territorial at ZEN, but is all constructed about the relationships between people in their own home. What have people done in the blocks and between the blocks? So hordes of barbarians, smashed houses, improper use of domestic space, no privacy. So we find that the people who built the islands, they took their cut. They built with poor materials and then took the quality, the cut off the top. So the people who live there are stigmatized because on the basis of a construction of space. So the built space is a kind of a metaphor for social space. So what's needed is redemption on both sides. So how do you establish your relation with these people? If you listen to the narratives of the people living there, they bring back from the cosmos, the term we used before. These people entered houses that were destroyed and abandoned. They relayed the tiles. They rebuilt walls as they wanted. They put in sanitation services. So they've brought order where there was disorder before. And it is in fact they are the ones who maintain the district, because the public authority has not done much to improve it. So also Vicky, who is a transsexual, who found a place to live in a city that doesn't have a space for people like him who are different. He transformed his dwelling, drawing on the architect of Gaudi in Barcelona. So that's what they do. Here we see a change. There was no tiles. There were no tiles. So they close up the public spaces, they build workshops, garages, or even also they close off. And before we saw that people can build upwards, but now we see that people are building inside empty spaces. So in that way, they enlarge the apartment because they find it too small. Otherwise, what they do? They open windows where there were no windows. They build loggias. You can see. Here you can see changes that they've done. And these are internal changes. As I asked residents to take photos, it wasn't me. I got no right to go in. because I didn't want to be a voyeur. So I was wondering how I could interpret this. Many experts in Italy, they don't see these changes, or if they see them, they interpret them as illegal acts. We were talking about privatization, but what we see here, we're talking about transgression. Or they just call it DIY, the kind of DIY you find in a small village or somewhere. But I think that it's more complex than that. And this type of experiment with excess, we were talking about excess and limits. For me, here we see some more interior views, photos taken by residents. I think that these types of districts are on the edge, at the limits, on the boundary, in the sense that they are revelatory spaces. They are apocalyptic places, to quote from the Bible. So what's happening? They reveal what's happening in the order that's supposed to govern the city. As Bourdieu said, what's going on in these districts? In order to understand them, you have to understand what's going outside the district. So what's under question in ZEN is the whole outside system. What about the land market, the real estate market? The historical transformation of the employment market, the labor market, because 70% of these people are formally unemployed, but they all work on the black market and they actually support the city. So what's happening here? It's the relation to space. It's a transformation, which is the transformation. What my interpretation is that this opening up of windows and doors is to occupy empty spaces with garages. Everything you've seen on the photos takes on some meaning at a scale which is not the scale of function. Of course, there are different levels. I don't have time, but particularly the ground floor apartments are very, very small. But also if we change the scale, then the question of meaning changes as well. When I look at the biography, the life stories of these people, what they're trying to do is to re-establish control over a life that is escaping their control. Because what we're seeing is an economic and symbolic collapse. So what we see in the buildings, in a situation, a context where nobody's in control, because there are no controls, there's also the informal market. There are no such things as, when I live in an apartment, it's my right. If you want to come, I can sell it to you because I put in the toilets, I put in the tiling. It's a way of continuing the effort to control one's own life in a context where people who live in ZEN are completely deprived of control, because if you live, for example, if you live in the ZEN state, people just won't employ you. 100 meters away, no problem. But lots of young women who have partners, the young women say they don't live in the ZEN. They say they live a street nearby. There's a stigmatization that means that anybody who's associated with ZEN has lost control of their lives. So this relationship to built space is another way of interpreting what is meant by the practices of people. What do we mean by practices and uses? How do I use those terms? So it's a serious question for our colloquium. How can we interpret and read the meaning, which is not a meaning that's often accepted or thought about, in this relationship to the built space? It's a question that's not just for architects. Obviously, architects want to know in what way such uses are important in order to design a project. But the question I ask myself, is there a way, a respectful way of getting people to talk? A way of recognizing something original in this transformation? Something that cannot simply be transcribed, associated with function or with use. Recognizing that it's not just a question of deficit, but something original that needs to be understood without the desire to want to control it. So, there is creativity. How do we interpret it in these cases? It's not just creativity in space. I could say much more about this. I need to move on, but what I particularly liked was this interpretation of a block, because it made me think once more about a very similar question without how do we compare all these cases? We know that these places are, in fact, implicitly incomparable. So that's the challenge. So I wanted to finish by returning to the question from the start. There are different levels, I think, for reading and interpreting these changes, these transformations. And the first transformation, the ZEN, was when it was occupied by people, by squatters. And they transformed it, they changed it. They went beyond everything that was predicted. There were collusions, there was organized crime, which you don't find in ZEN.
Avec toutes les commissions d'une ville qui vit de ces lieux. Merci.
I will speak in English, though, and I first, of course, want to thank the organizers for this colloquium and for bringing everybody together from all different parts of the world. Small technical questions. And I will then continue this afternoon with a presentation on Zanzibar, and more particularly the case of Michenzani. And with that case, I want to highlight the expectations and also the realities of modernity in that case. So just very quickly, what I will present today is, first of all, the project itself, which is called The Trains of Michenzani, which you could also see on the program. They are called like that because of their form, and I will come back to that in just a bit. So where did it come from? How was it made, the project itself? But then also to de-zoom a bit and to go more into detail about what was the urban condition and also the urban history of Zanzibar City, as it is very important to understand and to integrate that into the discourse of the modernist project itself. And then, of course, what we are here to discuss in these 3 days is what has happened to this modernist project after its occupation, and how did the hereafter of this modernist project work, and what can we see actually with the everyday patterns that I have observed during fieldwork a few years ago in the blocks itself, and afterwards a small conclusion. So for those who are not very familiar with the situation, so we're in East Africa, and Zanzibar City is actually located on an island, which is Unguja Island, right in front of the coast of Tanzania. And Zanzibar City is situated on the west coast. It's a very important, or it used to be a really important node on the international trade route between India, Africa, and Europe. And so it has always been a melting pot of cultures and of different origins. So here we see a situation a bit more into detail, a bit more closely. I've zoomed on the two islands themselves, where we can see the situation, of course, of Michenzani in Zanzibar City. And then I've zoomed on the city itself as well, where you can see the very clear double figure in the city. So first of all, Stone Town on the more western part, which is really the coastline itself, actually, and which is historically the slave trader city, and which has been colonized by many different nations, and which has always been the center of attention, basically. And then on the other, up more right side, it's the beginning of, because there's of course more following to the right, but it's the beginning of what was so-called the African city, which is in their language Ngambo, and which literally means the other side, so which speaks for its own. And then the project itself, where you can see the 10 slabs of Michenzani, which are located here. So a bit more of background on the project itself, the trains of Michenzani. So in the aftermath of the revolution of 1964, Zanzibar City, as well as the entire island, underwent significant transformations. After centuries of foreign occupation, Zanzibar regained its independence, and its People's Republic of Zanzibar was established, and it's got its first president, Abeid Amani Karume, who, at the dawn of his presidency, initiated the plan to reshape the city of Zanzibar, not only as a African and modern city, but also as a socialist city. And in doing so, he was assisted by consultants from the German Democratic Republic, as, for example, Hubert Scholz. And this collaboration actually resulted in a new master plan for the city, but actually also for the entire two islands, and this was made in 1968. The overall scheme implied the construction of 10 new towns, and where you can see that 7 of those have been initiated or have been completed, and those were spread over the islands of both Pemba and Unguja. And it would provide, that was the initial goal, it would provide the entire population with modern housing. So, as I said, the earlier development plans, colonial life and large investments had focused almost exclusively on Stone Town, and now the master plan developed by Scholz's team focused on the city of Zanzibar entirely, but mostly on the right side. Karume, the president, had now indicated Ngambo as the center of the new urban intervention. Ngambo, which was situated east of a previous creek, so the empty land that you can notice here. And it was the area now to which the African population would be resettled. And so it was the New Town Zanzibar project would thus redevelop the African settlement, which was not by chance labeled the other side. So this is the plan that we see for the entire western part of the city, where we can also see actually how Ngambo looked like before the intervention of the master plan. What we can also see is that besides housing, the project also included a large part of infrastructure works. The territory would be reorganized by large boulevards that were spread out and that would actually build across, as you can see, over what used to be Ngambo. And apart from that, there was also services included in the plan, like, for example, schools or stadiums and so on and so forth. The original plan was much more than what was realized in the end. On the upper left, what you can see is actually a huge densification program, which was meant to have almost 7,000 flats in more than 229 buildings for almost 30,000 people. What in the end was realized were the Michenzani trains, is what you can see on the right side, which were actually just 10 blocks aligned along the big crossroads that was constructed, and that each have measurements of 200 to 300 meters long and 5 to 8 stories high. The construction began in 1969. By 1973, 5 blocks were finalized and 5 others were initiated. And then it took actually until 2010 to finalize the last of the housing blocks. So the new flats were to be what was called the crown of the town, its tallest buildings and centered within Gambo. And as you can see here below, the construction works of Michenzani, which were massive, were executed exclusively by African labor in contrast with earlier development plans. And until today, as I could have been hearing from testimonies, actually the residents are extremely proud to have taken part in the construction itself of this project for development. So these are just a few examples of the buildings and the plans and the models from those new towns over the different islands, but then also how you can see on the upper left the roadworks that actually go straight through the indigenous settlements of before. Then the ASP, which is the political party, Afro-Shirazi party, so they have their headquarters also in the new, of course, in the new neighborhood. They provided a stadium, which is quite important. And then these are images of these blocks themselves. So the Michenzani blocks, which you can see, have quite some close inspiration of the East German Plattenbau and also the Soviet collective housing models. So their longitudinal and repetitive nature contrasts clearly with the pre-existing neighborhood, as you could see before. 8 of the slabs are 300 meter long and 2 measure 200 meter, and all work with the same base module. Typologies were almost literal copies of the existence minimum dwellings used in the socialist East German housing at the time and consisted of 2 to 3 bedroom flats. So this is an image where you can see how the blocks have been, well, compared to the latter one, how they have been aging over time, how there also have been colors added, but also vegetation that came into the streets that has grown over time, because we can see even though some of the latest blocks have been finalized just about 6-7 years ago, anyways, the first ones are over 45 years old, so multiple generations have been inhabiting the space, and also, as we have seen from the many stories before me, they have had the opportunities to change it to their needs and to try to adapt it to their cultural habits and living habits. So I would like to start a bit, or de-zoom a bit, or more theorize a bit, by quoting Mariam van Asten, who said, "Though they were hybrid translations, modernist houses and settlements with their whitewashed walls created the idea of a pure form and a hierarchy between the modern and the pre-modern. By asserting a temporal rupture between the contemporary and the traditional, modernism embraced the possibilities of industrialization and standardized forms. Nevertheless, modernism has been, mostly since the post-war period, subject to many critiques. Seen as radical alterations of indigenous landscapes, modernist interventions were often evaluated as alienating. But then the question is, did high modernism really fail? And I think from the many examples that we have been able to see today in many testimonies, there's many interpretations possible for this. And maybe it's not only just the modernism that was failing, it's maybe also the way that society was dealing with it, etc. So we have to see them, or we have to try to comprehend how the project's spatial structures have been and are experienced and weighed up by the inhabitants throughout their whole lifespan and after that. We have to see them as a frame and then try to understand how they can undergo multiple appropriations. So the question is not so much whether the project is a success or a failure, but rather to comprehend how the project's spatial structures have been and are experienced. So this is Michenzani today. Also a few pictures, so how people are living there, how also the proximity, as you can see on the lower left, with the low-rise tissue just around it is very present. So there's not much separation between both types of tissue, and then also how different activities happen within. So also inside and outside. We've heard a lot about lodges that have been closed off, which you can also see on the lower left. There's also various occupations happening inside the blocks. The blue room that you can see here on the right is, for example, a temporary classroom, which actually is inside a living room and has been transformed every single day from 11 to 2, because then that's the time that the students arrive. And then on the lower right, the last picture is actually a hairdressing saloon that's introduced on the 3rd floor in one of the blocks, which you have to really know before you can go there. So this is a bit of context of what happened today. So the hereafter of this modernist project is when the realities of life become prevalent, as you can see in these pictures. It seems to be about interweaving other structures of everyday life in the original frames. Nature, informal uses, and domestic activities literally grow over the concrete structures, also in Michenzani. So if Karumis Michenzani can be read as an African socialist inscription on a former condition, the ways in which the everyday construction of the city has continued to transform Michenzani can be seen as an inscription on an inscription. And then just a little bit on this duality of the city, what I was talking about before, Stone Town versus the African city in Ngambo. And even though the 1968 plan was extremely drastic, Zanzibar nevertheless remains being shaped by multiple ideological plans throughout its urban history. And it seems as if Stone Town and Ngambo have been false protagonists in the urban play of vernacular and political landscapes, while state views or ideologies were the directors. The politicization of the vernacular and vice versa created an intriguing leapfrogging over the creek and back. At each stage, the pre-colonial, colonial, as well as post-colonial era plans were created aiming to reconfirm or change radically the order of terms. So this is what these few diagrams actually want to say, is that the focus throughout history has always been changing back and forth. And this is also one of the reasons why Michenzani has been put on the Ngambo side after the revolution, and why it's also actually part of what always has been the African tissue. It's just in another configuration, another way, and so it's been vernacularized actually after its intervention. So I'm just showing a few historical slides to understand this evolution of the site itself. So with the natural creek that you can see very present here, and a very different landscape in Stone Town and in Ngambo, which then in the 1920s became subject of a plan of the British, which were one of the colonizing parties in Zanzibar, and they actually started to canalize this natural creek in order for sanitary reasons, etc., etc., and they wanted to organize and order actually the whole site of Ngambo. So that was the first time, and then actually there's been many more interventions, but the most important ones I'm showing here. And then you see the master plan that we've been talking about before, which was actually on a much bigger scale than the 1920s plan, also trying to order and structure, but this time in order to excel and in order to become the new center of Zanzibar City. And then the situation as we see it today, with the different elements of the plan, apart from Michenzani, that are also cut out. So for example, a hotel and a stadium, and there was also a elderly home, and etc. And then the evolution in section, where you can see very clearly how the landscape changed and how actually Michenzani was kind of out of scale, if I can say it like that, towards what was already there, and how this initiated then from the 1960s on an evolution in more high-rise buildings and more large-scale plans and interventions on the entire island. So if we then zoom into the scale of the unit, a myriad of micro-stories becomes prevalent. The everyday patterns in Michenzani today are being laid out through individual experiences and observed trends. So as I said, after 45 years of inhabitation, it becomes really interesting to see and to experience together with the inhabitants these blocks. And so this is what I have been doing for quite some time a few years ago, and for which I then distilled 45 interviews inside of the blocks, and then also a few in the low-rise tissue that were just adjacent to the blocks, in order to try to understand, first of all, what's happening, what is wanted and what is admired or detested, which is also possible. And then actually we've heard a lot already about adaptations, transformations, and so on. And what I then try to do with the case studies that I will also show a few of here is to try to categorize, but in a different way, trying to look at it or trying to go beyond this dual interpretation of changing habits or changing physically the structure, but, and I will come back to that in a minute, is try to really structure it according to very specific Michenzani issues. So first of all, of course, after all of these interviews, a bit of sample analysis to try to understand the inhabitants of these blocks. Where do they come from? How many of them were original inhabitants? How many of them already lived in actually Michenzani area, or do they come from the entire other side of the island? And how many have relations with people that live just around in the tissue? Of course, Zanzibar, as I said, it's a melting pot, so also ethnicity, nationalities, and so on is quite impressive, how it's mixed and how it's present in the site itself. And then here on the right, you can see the different units. So there's 2 and 3 bedroom units, which is of course important in sizes of family and so on and so forth. And then not only the blocks came in between 1968 and now, but also inhabitants. Some of them live since the very first day in Michenzani, have never left, and others have just been recently arriving there. So these are all just very factual representations to then come to these interpretations that we've tried to put together. So there's 3 categories that I would like to discuss shortly. So bricolage, assemblage, and collage. So luckily these are the same words in French. So today it works out well. So bricolage is actually something which is en attendant the catastrophe. So it's actually trying to work with and trying to maintain certain quality, even though there's some catastrophe coming close. Assemblage is actually working a lot with the term mismatches. So we're going to try to see what between who's inhabiting the unit and the unit itself, there can be in different forms mismatches. So, and how do they react on it? Either adapting the units, either trying to see how can they split up or how can they assemble functions within the units, etc., etc. And then the collage is actually referring back to the compound architecture, so the indigenous African settlement, which we saw just next to the Michenzani blocks as well. So how do they reinterpret habits and architectural qualities from there into the blocks, or how do they work with different compound constellations in Michenzani? So these are the 3 large categories that I will shortly talk about. So if we talk about bricolage, maybe first a bit of background. So it's also coming from the term bricolage from Lévi-Strauss, who defined bricolage as a very ad hoc approach that is uniquely related to the present in space and time. So the bricoleur's universe of instruments is closed, and the rules of his game are always to make do with whatever is at hand. That is to say, with a set of tools and materials which is always finite and is also heterogeneous because what it contains bears no relation to the current project. So he sees bricolage as a mythical language and completely opposed to the strictly organized and meticulously anticipating mind of the engineer. Bricolage in Michenzani is expressed in all of the physical testimonies of life within the blocks, which are subject to individual choice-making and continuous adaptations. At the same time, bricolage also stresses the aging and reveals the worn-out aspects of the concrete slabs. A closer look reveals some indications of an imminent breakdown, with cracks and age spots steadily appearing, which I try to indicate in these facade drawings. It's a combination of harsh climatic conditions, local dwelling cultures, a lack of resources for the much-needed maintenances, as well as local technical expertise, and this has initiated environmental degradation. Each and every inhabitant has his own bricolage response to these issues of a breakdown. So the most prominent deficiency is the lack of water supply, especially up on the higher floors. Pressure is insufficient to serve all units. Consequently, individual water pumps are randomly installed, which you can also see here, and the small pipes cover the building's facades. Only on specific days the buildings have water supply, easily recognizable by the continuous humming of the countless pumps. Families save up their water by storing it into large tanks, which they keep in the apartments, on the roofs, or in the interface zone. When they're outside of the flats, water tanks are carefully enclosed by concrete capsules. Other families choose not to invest in a pump, but to purchase barrels with clean water from the private market. And so does Mr. Mbaruk, who lives on the 4th floor in Block 4. And he says they would always steal the pump or the pipes, so I would rather not invest in it. Due to his age, he depends on his young neighbor to help him carry the barrels up to his floor. This is quite an undertaking, since Mbaruk has 7 other family members living in his flat, which requires a significant amount of barrels. So this is one of the inhabitants which I got to know during my fieldwork. And so this is his family situation. So as you can see, there are quite many in one apartment, but they still try to work it out into one unit, which has changed a lot over time. Of course, the family extended and they became more and more people until there's even rooms with 4 spaces to sleep. So Mr. Mbaruk clearly mentioned to me, this is a very problematic for me, that there's no water, etc., because he lives on one of the higher floors. Then if we go to Assemblage, so when reviewing inhabitation, many cases evoke the thought of a mismatch. Common social structures have been disrupted since the architecture was foreign and incompatible with traditional lifestyles. The extended family structures and the related compound architectures and culture are not accommodated in the East German-inspired standardization of dwelling units. So the constrained space units offer is by no means corresponding to the ever-expanding and complex Zanzibari social and spatial configurations. Even though the strict design of the apartment blocks does not immediately allow for the growth or shrinkage of the basic residential unit, inhabitants have come up with several solutions to face the mismatch between maximum family and minimum flat. So, Assemblage is a format for oppositional knowledge. It questions received ideas, challenges entrenched institutions, and values and strays from permissible terrain. So what you can see here is one of those slabs, and everything that happens in there is actually anything but what has been intended by the original architects. So families try to squat with up to 12 people in a 2-bedroom flat. There's people that change their spaces, so they become flexible spaces that change during day or night. Uses are quite flexible. Also, as mentioned before, so incorporation of different activities, the hairdresser or the school, the classroom, and then also sometimes people that start to really transform rooms, extra partitions that come into the rooms, or that start to change rooms. For example, I've seen one of the kitchens that became a bedroom, since actually they don't use the kitchen that was standardized European, and they like to cook on their balcony. So within this frame, which is a concrete, rigid frame, everybody's agreeing on that, I think there's so much flexibility identified by the inhabitants, that these mismatches are actually easily accommodated and that they are worked with rather than being seen as constraints. So just one example of that is here, Mrs. Turkiye, a very nice lady, who actually is alone in her unit, but then moved even out to another neighborhood. But she liked Michenzani that much that she stayed in Michenzani, but just for her business. She has a ground floor flat. She extended it into the public space, or the collective space, as how you want to call it, made a small garden, has a massage salon and a hairdresser salon. So she is making use of this unit still, while she's actually living quite far away, and she's going back and forth every single day. So before she has been living there, she was very happy, but she wanted to extend her family and so on, and she found that the conditions to have and her hairdresser salon and her family in this one unit became too much. So that's one of the cases. Then I'm just continuing to collage and the notion of collage, which is also a term that's a bit referring to Bator and Rouaud that we're talking about the Collage city, where they see it as a method to challenge the uniformity of modernism. It's a multiple reference of a dialectic between past and future, of an impacting of iconographic content, of a temporal as well as a spatial collision that one might proceed to specify an ideal city of the mind. Collage is thus an alternative to the tabula rasa approach of modernism, or at its best, a reinterpretation of it. In Michenzani, the collage happens post facto and is a reaction to the foreign modernist architecture. Tradition is brought back into the blocks by means of collaging elements of the compound architecture and culture in and onto them, creating a novel typology. So, as you can see, well, in the scheme, also this idea of bringing all of these elements of what you can see on top, how actually this compound architecture is made, is done, is lived, is actually, we can find all of these elements back into these slabs, into these blocks. So if we see the compound unbound is the discrepancy between traditional living culture and modern architecture with foreign ideas and engenders comparable transformations. So space is revisited in order to recover compound components. That would be one of the aspects. On the other hand, we have compound constellations, as in the case that is shown here. So when an extended family stretches actually across different units in one or more blocks, the process can be considered as a vertical translation or reinterpretation of the traditional compound culture. In the blocks, social networks indeed continue to cluster around one common space, though this is rarely found in its original form as a courtyard. It therefore needs to be replaced, and inhabitants have made what they can of the extensive staircase and corridor networks the multi-story block features, not to mention the potential of the rooftop space. So this family actually owns, the extended family then, of course, owns several units in the block, in one of the blocks of Michenzani. During the day, all of them are on the ground floor flat, and then actually, as it moves, as time goes by, actually they move between blocks. Some sleep with their uncle or aunt in order to have more space, and they actually split up again, but there's one meeting space, and which is a block which also has this outside space where they have a small kitchen garden. So the notions that they had before in their compound architecture, they really take it again, and they install these things in the Michenzani blocks as well. And then the compound figures within the tissue itself. So if we're talking about in-between slabs, I think this is the slide that talks about it, let's say. So the way in which compounds have been unbounded to the point of inscribing some of their semi-private and semi-public activities on the broader domain of the street or the corridors and staircases of the block themselves, illustrates a capacity to revisit and reshape customary dwelling practices. That being so, the dynamism that has allowed the Swahili compound to intermingle different ages remains the first ingredient to build on when one reimagines both Michenzani and the surrounding neighborhoods of Ngambo. A sense of hybridization can be experienced clearly when we walk along the interface zone. This area is the point of major contact between the two contrasting fabrics. It is here that one finds extraordinary elements that can benefit from both morphologies. Home-based economic activities flourish, as for example the bicycle shop, and to allow them to thrive further, houses expand. Besides the residential units themselves, the interface area is also a place of concentration and accumulation of exceptional spaces. Occupations of various duration result in an ever-changing environment. Shaded playgrounds and patches of cultivated green are alternated with stalls for informal commerce, parking lots, water pumps, and garbage collection points. Children engage in recreation both in the playgrounds and in the parking areas. Neighbors gather around an informal car wash, and craftsmen congregate close to the staircases. In the same space, a large retail area for fridges, as you can see there, and television is suddenly set up, almost improvised. When one looks carefully, it is far from an unrehearsed act, but a dance of livelihoods that fades only when night falls and the entire interface is transformed into a parking space. The traditional compound figures that ensure semi-private outdoor living, mostly the courtyard or uwani, and semi-public interactions, the barazza, can also be found in the areas adjacent to the blocks. Both are key spaces of socialization in Swahili culture and therefore essential for the Ngambo residents. After all of these illustrations, let's say, I'd like to end with some concluding terms. I've called it from Fremdkörper to interwoven artifact and the shifting perceptions. So the steady integration of the Michenzani project into the built fabric, the minds of the inhabitants and immaterial culture over time. The socialist slabs, initially a real Fremdkörper in the low-rise tissue of Ngambo, but at the same time holding the promise of modernity, have endured realities of life and have been reduced to the concrete frames necessary as the base for reinvented dwelling practices. It seems as if concrete robustness simultaneously invites dynamic inhabitation and a lively dwelling culture. The multitude of microstories illustrates how the collective adaptation to a rigid and alienating structure like the blocks ultimately materializes a shift in perception. So the multiple adaptations are cultural expressions and originate in a very strong tradition of extended families and compound architecture. The traditional Swahili compound as main housing topology in Ngambo is very flexible in nature, and the vernacular house has no troubles in modernizing, densifying, and sometimes even extending vertically. Another crucial facet of these concluding reflections on Michenzani and the impact of the 10-block intervention on the urban structure is the question of centrality. The continuously changing hierarchy between Stone Town and Ngambo has only seemingly faded in recent years. So Ngambo appears to have become inherently part of Zanzibar's center today. In actual fact, it is more of a city center for Zanzibar's residents than Stone Town used to be. Indeed, Ngambo has become more than the town for natives of colonial times, and Michenzani is more than the socialist housing estate conceived during the revolutionary years. Over time, it has accommodated shifting dwelling structures and cultures and integrated civic functions. In 2013, Michenzani can be seen as a place where urban life is concentrated and from there on proliferates. The second life, or hereafter, of the Michenzani project is revealed by microstories of its inhabitants, which illustrate that the project has shifted from a Fremdkörper to an interwoven artifact, from a static to a dynamic urban neighborhood, from a place from being passively lodged to being actively inhabited, from an alien site to home space. Thank you.